warm welcome to colleagues, friends, guests, all of you here present today in the room, but also a big welcome to those joining us online as well today. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we are gathering today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across the Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respect to elders past and present and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. I'm Kathryn Bowen, Professor of Climate, Environment and Global Health and Deputy Director of Melbourne Climate Futures and Director of the Climate Catch Lab here at the University of Melbourne. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon to the launch of the 2025 Medical Journal of Australia and Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. We are delighted to host the launch on behalf of the whole authorship team from across Australia and the broader Pacific, with a special acknowledgement of the Director of the Oceania Countdown, who has been steadily steering the report for many years now, Professor Paul Beggs from Macquarie University. Welcome, Paul. As you would all be aware, we are now seeing an unprecedented level of attention and interest in climate change and human health. However, this is not necessarily translating into more funding and other support for our area. What it means is that it's even more important to be contributing to these types of stock takes of climate action to make sure that we are actively advocating for a greater focus on climate change as it relates to our human health and well-being. As universities, we have a responsibility to inform the public debate and engage with policymakers at all levels, and not just policymakers, and we might come to that point in our panel. At the University of Melbourne, we have worked hard to harness and synergise our strengths in climate change and human health to do exactly this. It's critical for us to be able to actively participate in policy debates and formulation, progress our applied research activities, and nurture the next generation of global health and climate change advocates. The MJA-Lancet Countdown report is a powerful example of a concrete way that we can accelerate action towards climate resilient, sustainable and equitable communities and health systems in Australia and beyond. And at the university, we're delighted to play our role in this collaborative, interdisciplinary network of researchers, practitioners, educators and strategic thinkers, advancing this knowledge and action at the nexus of climate change and human health. You will have noticed that we're gathering today at the law school, which is apt, given one of this year's new indicators is on how human health is being included in climate litigation. Melbourne Climate Futures had our original office space in this building, and I would enter with some trepidation, wary of these high-flying and somewhat intimidating legal types, what they would think about a public health person wandering through the corridors and quietly hoping, actually, that I wouldn't be forced into conversation in the lift. But I have since become firm colleagues and friends with many in the law school, including, of course, the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures, Professor Jackie Peel, who unfortunately can't be here with us today, as well as her formidable team, including the incredibly talented Rebekkah Markey-Towler, who is joining us today on the panel. And some of you might also know that one of our other panellists, Dr. Selina Lo, also has a background in law, which we might hear about a little bit later. So I can happily confirm that there is no need to be afraid of these legal types. In fact, the opposite is true. They are keen to engage with us and definitely know a thing or two about how to get voices heard, which is exactly what we continue to need in the climate and health space. So without further ado, I will introduce the panel and we'll get started on our panel discussion. So firstly, I'd love to introduce Professor Sant-Rayn Pasricha. So Santa, as we can call you, is a haematologist, epidemiologist and biologist, and you have just been appointed as the head of school at the University of Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. Santa leads the WHO Collaborating Centre for Anemia Detection and Control, and he collaborates deeply across the school, the university, the precinct and internationally. Santa is also a laboratory head at WEHI, the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, where he previously served as acting deputy director and division head, and is a consultant haematologist at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre. Santa's research program has a record of resolving key evidence gaps, making transformative scientific discoveries and translating knowledge into policy at the highest international level, including informing WHO guidelines. Santa has published as a lead author in The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature Medicine and many other esteemed journals, and his work has attracted support from the NHMRC and international donors, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So welcome, Santa. Professor Paul Beggs. Paul is a professor in the School of Natural Sciences at Macquarie University in Sydney, and Paul is the director of the Lancet Countdown Oceania Regional Centre and produces the annual MJA-Lancet Countdown report. Paul is an environmental health scientist with a background in biological and climate sciences and is an international authority on the impacts of climate change on allergens and allergic diseases. And in the case of Victoria, you've made an incredible contribution around our thunderstorm asthma early warning system, so many thanks for that. And Paul previously won the Eureka Prize for Medical Research for his groundbreaking work, and in 2023, Paul and colleagues were presented with the Public Health Association of Australia Tony McMichael Public Health Ecology and Environment Award for the Countdown work. Welcome, Paul. Dr. Selina Namchee Lo. Selina has nearly 3 decades experience in global and international health with qualifications in medicine, tropical medicine, and a master's in public and international law. Selina's currently also the consulting editor for The Lancet, where she was previously a senior editor based in London and Beijing. She has been handling editor of a number of global health peer-reviewed commissions, including the Rockefeller Lancet Planetary Health Report, the first Lancet series on transgender health, and Global Health 2035, Investing in Health. Selina is currently the Executive Director of the Australian Global Health Alliance. And Selina has worked in many places around the world, including Afghanistan, Myanmar, China, Thailand and Bangladesh, specifically with refugee, stateless, ethnic minority communities. You've got an incredible international background, Selina, so it will be wonderful to hear more about your perspectives at an international level. Also, just to note, Selina retains an active interest in the arts and local community, by supporting correspondences and by writing the occasional art review. Rebekkah Markey-Towler, or Beck Markey-Towler, is a PhD candidate at the Melbourne Law School and a research fellow with Melbourne Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne. Beck's research interests are, as we will hear, in climate litigation and sustainable finance, with her PhD examining the regulation of mortgage lending in a changing climate. Beck is a co-host and producer of the Climate Talks podcast and manages the database on climate litigation in Australia, which was the database used to inform the indicator in this year's report. Prior to working at the university, Beck was the executive associate to a judge on the Federal Court of Australia. And I can definitely say, Beck, you're one of the warmest and welcoming legal types that I've come across. So welcome today. And then finally, Arthur Wyns. Arthur is a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, where he studies government responses to the health impacts of climate change. So Arthur sits within Melbourne Climate Futures, and he's an editor of the Journal of Climate Change and Health and is an experienced advisor on climate policy and global environmental governance, regularly advising national governments, UN agencies and academic institutions. Previously, Arthur has also been a senior policy advisor for the Lancet Countdown. He's also been a climate change advisor in the World Health Organization and has represented the WHO and the global health community at UN climate negotiations since COP23. And that's a few COPs ago, so you've got a bit of a history in the COP. Few too many, okay. So incredible panel, wonderful to know about all of your background, and I think that sets the scenes for a terrific discussion. Before we start the panel though, we do have some remarks from our Assistant Minister of Health, the Honourable Member Ged Kearney. And the Assistant Minister has been a big supporter of climate and health. She couldn't be here today for obvious reasons. We're in an election period. It's caretaker mode. So she was able to kindly pre-record a message for us, and it'll go for a few minutes and we'll just press play. Thank you, Beth.
Hello and welcome. Thank you to Melbourne Climate Futures for hosting the launch of the 2025 Medical Journal of Australia Lancet Countdown on health and climate change. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to elders past and present. Your custodianship for tens of thousands of years of the lands and waterways in this region enriches us all. I extend that respect to other First Nations people joining today's launch event. I also acknowledge Professor Sant-Rayn Pasricha, Head of Melbourne's University School of Population and Global Health. And congratulations to Professor Paul Beggs on his role compiling the report. And I'd like to thank everyone who helped with this report and the University of Melbourne for convening this discussion. Our beautiful world is suffering the effects of climate change, and the health and economic costs of inaction are never far behind, whether it's the recent fires in the Grampians or in WA and Tasmania. The flooding caused by a very late in the season tropical cyclone in Queensland and New South Wales, and the drought in South Australia. It comes at a devastating cost to lives and livelihoods. It also comes as a cost to our health, the healthcare system and the wider economy. We are witnessing in real time how climate change is affecting the health and well-being of people at home and abroad. Impacts which will only increase in the coming decades without real and lasting action. However, when we talk about climate change, we cannot despair that it's all too catastrophic and that there's nothing we can do. There is a lot we can do and a lot we must do. We must maintain our hope, our passion, our commitment to doing anything we can, even if our contribution is big or small. I know being the Assistant Minister for Health and Aged Care in the Albanese Labor government means that my commitment must be a larger one. And it's why the Albanese Labor government established the National Health Sustainability and Climate Unit in 2022. We have also delivered our first ever National Health and Climate Strategy, which I was very proud to launch at COP28 in Dubai. The strategy will help deliver healthy, climate resilient communities and a sustainable, resilient, high quality net zero health system. Because right now we know our health system contributes around 5.4% of greenhouse gas emissions. We achieved a lot since the strategy was launched. We've expanded our work to support building sustainable and climate resilient health systems in the Pacific. We announced $2.5 million for a Pacific Climate Health Resilient Package as part of the Partnerships for Healthy Region initiative. We're also tackling unique sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the health system, including work on how we can do away with desflurane. We also announced $17 million in new climate and health research funding. The intersection of climate and health is particularly significant for our communities, and it's an issue that the Labor government and myself have paid particular attention to. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the Climate and Health Expert Advisory Group, particularly Professor Kathryn Bowen, for highlighting the strong link between quality research and effective policy. I want to thank all the Australian academics, many of whom are authors of the report being launched today, who are working to build a better evidence base on how to respond to the health impacts of climate change and how to deliver care more sustainably. The Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change has played an important role in establishing climate and health as a recognised field of health policy worldwide. And the MJA-Lancet Countdown is playing a critical role in building up academic and policy-making expertise on climate and health here in Australia and across the region. So it's great to hear that your report has found that there are strong signs that Australians are increasingly engaged and acting on health and climate change. And your new indicator on health and climate change litigation in Australia demonstrates the legal system is active on this issue. It's also positive to read in your report that solar now provides almost 40% of Australia's electricity, with growth in both large and small-scale renewable generation and battery storage systems. But your report also shows there's still much more to be done. And I know that my parliamentary colleagues, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, and the Minister for the Environment and Water, Tanya Plibersek, are fully committed and active towards reaching net zero. I also acknowledge that further progress requires collaboration between government, community stakeholders and academic experts like yourselves. I endeavour to do so, especially if the Albanese Labor government is re-elected. I acknowledge the many of you who have persistently advocated for human and planetary health over decades and welcome their ongoing contributions and leadership. You've kept climate action on the map and in the spotlight. My congratulations on delivering this year's report and for your continued advocacy, leadership and passion. Thank you.
All right. So given that as a background and a bit of an overview of what the federal government has been supporting over the last few years, I suppose it'd be good to start our discussion, Santa, with you in terms of what do you think we need to be doing next? So we've seen a bit of support for health and climate at a federal level. It varies across states and territories. Internationally, as I said, exposure has been increasing, but are we actually just tinkering at the edges?
Thanks, Kathryn. Oh, hang on. And thank you very much for having me this afternoon. I'd also like to just acknowledge your role in putting today together, but also your leadership in this field right across the university. And so I just really want to congratulate you for your outstanding leadership. We really value it. I think I might answer that question in a couple of different ways. This morning I was asked to actually join the Centre for Health Equity, which is a group within our school that thinks about how societal influences ultimately result in impaired health outcomes and how they and how we can adjust society or consider how we can change the way society is actually organised to improve health, among other outcomes. And I think actually, if you think about the structures of society and how they influence health, well, if we think about the biggest change that is coming our way, in fact, that has arrived, it's going to be around the environment in which we live in heating, floods, droughts, and bushfires, for example, in Australia. And I think related to that, then, the challenge I gave that group and the challenge I give ourselves is that actually are we still just tinkering around the edges in terms of how we might enact change around health? In other words, is climate change and health actually the main game in town? And it's an engine room around which we actually need to organise our thinking around how we respond to public health and clinical health over the next few decades. And so, in a way, if you think about it upside down, where research often occurs in a highly fragmented fashion. So you have people working on particular conditions or diseases or drugs or biomedical discoveries, and then with a very small fraction of the grant income, we bolt on a climate change idea to that. But actually, potentially, what's really driving all of it, or one of the major drivers for all of it, is going to be the impact of climate change over the forthcoming decades. And so I guess the challenge I set for myself and for our school, and then more for the faculty more broadly, is how we bring a lens of climate change to much more of our activities, even all of our activities going forwards, and how that would influence, for example, cancer research or respiratory research, how it would influence immunology research. We have experimental evidence maybe that heating affects the immune system. It likely has effects right across every organ system. So if that's the type of research you do, there's going to be a need there. And of course, then at a broader public health level, how do we organise our efforts to engage with this problem? And then just relating to my thinking around my discussion with health equity, if we think about the fundamental nuts and bolts of how we find ourselves in this position and where the effects will be felt, the people who will be affected and will suffer the health impacts of climate change are not the people who got us into this position and not the people who caused the situation. And you can think of that in multiple different axes, but it's almost the perfect scenario where the people who are going to be impacted are not the people who brought us there. So I think just having that lens around how we influence government funding and how things are directed is important to keep in mind.
Thank you. Wonderful to listen to the critical role that you see climate change plays in everything that we do, from the public health perspective all the way to the clinical. And I think with that, it would be great to now move to Paul and ask, what are some of the high level statements coming out of this year's report, and perhaps how they might link into what Santa's also just referred to.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn. So good afternoon, everyone, and it's delightful to be here in Melbourne and at the University of Melbourne. So I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of this year's report. It's a very big report, so I don't have time to go through it all in detail. But in terms of what is new in this year's report, you've already heard a bit of reference to the litigation indicator. So that was brought in recognition that the law is an important arena for action on health and climate change. So this is a world first, in fact, this new indicator looking at the intersection of health, climate change and litigation. So we used the database that has again been referred to, so the Australian and Pacific Climate Change Litigation Database, developed here at the University of Melbourne in Melbourne Climate Futures. And with an analysis of that database, looking for cases that relate to both climate change and human health, we found that there were 11 cases over the past decade that dealt with that issue. We went beyond that, though, to look at what types of cases were being dealt with. So we found three broad categories of cases coming into that space, the health and climate change space. So the first category of cases that are coming through is planning applications for developments that may exacerbate climate-related health impacts. The second category was cases challenging coal mines and coal-fired power stations on the grounds, including their impact on community health. And the third category was cases arguing that the health effects of climate-intensive activities, such as coal mines, on vulnerable populations create a duty of care or unjustifiably limit human rights. So that was the only new indicator that we had in this year's report, but it's a very important one. And as I said, there's great interest from overseas now in other regions in looking at that particular issue, so litigation, health and climate change. This year's report also includes two new panels focusing on particular topics. One of those is looking at the nursing response to health and climate change in Australia. We need a whole of health system response to this issue. So it's not just doctors and health researchers, it's also the allied health areas, nursing and so on. And the second panel that we include this year is looking at digital healthcare and how it can contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation in Australia. We've learned a lot about digital healthcare through COVID-19. And it's certainly not perfect, but there's ways in which we can use it to address various aspects of climate change. The report is also expanding in terms of its geographic scope. So we started off focusing on Australia, but increasingly we're becoming more regional, including, for example, New Zealand. So in 2022 and 2023, we included a panel, a section on New Zealand. But for the first time this year, we've actually tracked a number of our indicators for that country as well. So we're looking at things like displacement of the population, the cost of natural disasters and so on in New Zealand. And it's interesting that we started to do that this year because New Zealand has just gone through a time of massive displacement and massive cost associated with Cyclone Gabrielle. So we're going to continue that tracking in New Zealand, increase the number of indicators as time goes on. But it's also important to note that the other 24 indicators that we look at in the report have updated data. So there's a lot of new information in the report, entirely new sections, but also every indicator that we look at has new data so that we know exactly what is happening as time goes on. So Australia is making some progress in terms of health and climate change, and we heard the Assistant Minister talk about some of those things. So in addition to the National Health and Climate Change Strategy, Australia has just gone through the first pass of the National Climate Risk Assessment. And one of the areas being focused on in that assessment is the area of health and social support. We heard, I think also, that we now have 40% of Australia's electricity coming from renewables. So we had a slow start, but Australia is now making great progress in terms of the generation of electricity from renewables such as wind and solar. And one of the major conclusions of the report is that we need to keep that going and further ramp it up as time goes on. And in addition to that, we have Professor Mark Stevenson in the audience today, who works on one of our indicators looking at the uptake of electric vehicles in Australia. And that has really surged again over recent years. Again, we had a slow start in Australia, but in 2023, there were almost 100,000 electric vehicles sold in Australia, which was about 8.5% of all new vehicles in that year. So when it comes to transport in Australia, we need more electric vehicles, but we also need more active transport as well. So more cycling, more walking, more public transport. But electric vehicles will be one of the parts of that solution. So just to finish off with Kathryn, I wanted to talk about some of the areas that we are not doing well in and some of the opportunities that lie ahead. So obviously our exposure to climate change is increasing as time goes on. And the most obvious example of that is our increasing exposure to heat waves. So we are being exposed to more and more heat waves, more severe heat waves as time goes on. That is exposing us to heat stress and other health threats such as bushfires and drought. We also track our exposure to various other natural hazards, and also our response to the health and climate change issues, so adaptation and mitigation. Of great concern in this year's report, we look at the number of firefighting volunteers in Australia, and that is continually dropping over the past 7 years. So we now have about 40,000 fewer volunteer firefighters than we had 7 years ago. So that's about a 17% drop in a fairly short period of time. So our ability to fight these increasing hazards in that particular area is decreasing. There's a long way to go in terms of our overall energy production and our total energy supply. So although electricity generation in Australia is doing well with renewables, overall our energy production is not doing well. We continue to be dominated by fossil fuels, such as coal, oil and gas. And some of those are actually increasing as time goes on. So for the year 2021-22, the use of petrol actually went up rather than going down. And we also look at the healthcare sector because the healthcare sector is one of the contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in Australia and every other country around the world. And again, there's further work to be done there. The emissions of greenhouse gases from our healthcare sector itself went up in 2021, the most current year that we have data for. So although the National Health and Climate Strategy targets the health sector in terms of reducing emissions, we really need that to be implemented and to be implemented quickly. So just in terms of opportunities, there are many opportunities for Australia to be doing better. So we need to embrace those opportunities. We need to increase our greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. It's too low at the moment, so that needs to go up. We need greater ambition there. And as the Assistant Minister mentioned, we need better integration of policy. So more climate within the health policy and more health within our climate policies. So I'll leave it there, Kathryn.
Thank you, Paul. Terrific overview of the indicators this year, and congratulations again. You noted big issues there. You talked about we're still dominated by fossil fuels. You talked about the need for ambition, and I think that the role of this report as an advocacy tool is just so critical. And for many academics, that's not a place they necessarily find super comfortable. So it might be something to reflect on and to hear from the panel in our discussions around our roles as advocates in this field and how we support one another. But it's a good segue to Selina, because you do have a big advocacy role in many of your different activities at work and beyond. And one of those at the moment is looking at, well, how are we going to be working in the face of these global health challenges, where we're seeing particularly changes, as we all know, with the US's withdrawal from a variety of different international mechanisms, whether it be the Paris Agreement, whether it be the WHO. So from a global health perspective, Selina, we'd all love to hear your reflections on how we're seeing the scene play out, and our role as advocates perhaps too in that.
Thank you, Kathryn, both for the question and the opportunity to be on this really fantastic panel. I think before I begin, each of you are leaders in your own realms, and I feel actually really honoured to be here speaking with you. In terms of, just before I start on the challenges, congratulations on the report. In terms of I read the report with a bit of a global health lens, and huge ticks on the litigation indicator. Thank you so much for bringing that to the world. I hope that the Global Lancet report takes that up in its next iterations. Congratulations on the economic analysis. It was really solid and good. A pity about the zoonotic disease capacity that was reported, I think, is 60% or something like that, of not as good as it could be, especially given that we are facing emerging threats and diseases, and also a curiosity that the media mentions were lower in this last reporting period than the research publications, and that's just was more curiosity on my part. As for the future, what I would love to see in other reports, whether this one or other such reports, are indicators around the marginalised community involvement. By marginalised, meaning those that we tend to, as going to what Santa said earlier, looking at the bottom billion, looking at the communities that are most affected by any sort of, societal assaults. So migrants, and I know that you're looking forward towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander input too, because different knowledges, especially for those of us in the evidence generation world, different knowledges confront us to have co-design of different outcomes. So congratulations, that was really good. So for global health threats and trends, I really didn't know how to approach this without giving a long and perhaps negative litany, which I actually did yesterday at another presentation that I had with the Public Health Association of Australia, but it did end quite positively. In terms of the, the last Lancet Global Report did report that, depressingly, that of the 15 indicators, is that right? 10 were not going so well, 15, is that right? And then companies and government were to blame, and fossil fuel money needs to be redirected for wellbeing. Global health is all about really equity and the determinants of health. So while we have technical solutions, they're all really political challenges, and therefore political solutions have to be part of our technical approach. Right now, we're in kind of a historical moment. We've had decades of enjoyment of good child survival, increasing maternal mortality, in fact, increasing longevity overall in many of the high-income and middle-income countries around the world. But climate change as a big threat is compounding it. But additionally, and perhaps synergistically, in a negative way, it's compounded by mis and disinformation, as you saw during the pandemic, geopolitical shifts and right or wrong narratives around that and what happens to the health world in those shifts, but also to raise a sector that I started my career in, real compassion fatigue for the humanitarian crisis that we see all around the world. And compassion fatigue in the way measured in terms of donor, reduction of ODA, it's not only the US that has dismantled USAID and turned away from foreign aid assistance, it's also the UK and Germany. And together, those three donors make up half of ODA globally. So what do we do with that? And then also there is arguably, and I don't know because I'm not an expert in this, but compassion fatigue in our own communities when, you know, in the past, like when I went to Afghanistan when I was 25 years old, I could come back and everybody wanted to hear about it, or at least my community. Now, I think, you know, they read it on TikTok and they think everybody thinks they're an expert. And there is a degree of compassion fatigue, I think, that affects how we vote and what's important to us, compounded also by the cost of living. Throw into that this Trump effect, let's call it the Trump effect, and there are direct and indirect effects of the executive orders and what's happened since he's taken power with his administration that target global health. Not only the withdrawal, not only the dismantling of USAID and the Paris Agreement, but the start of all these executive orders that internally are not only an assault on the global order as we narrate it here, because not everybody relates the global order in the same way, depending where you sit in the world, but also an assault really on science, truth and evidence. And in our community, the so-called global health community, we are as much concerned about that assault, which right now is primarily only affecting American scientists and those collaborating with them, but it has a huge impact on how we go forward in research and also in terms of promoting our interests and values. Sharon Lewin, the professor who leads the Doherty Institute last week at one of our congresses, said that the dismantling of DEI is really a assault on science, because how do we do clinical trials without the knowledge of all the communities? So this layering of assaults is really problematic, but particularly the attack on gender, DI and migrants, because as you well know, and I think people like Arthur and Kathryn and Paul publish and write about, that women and children and migrants are those most affected in countries that are most affected by climate change. I wanted just to spend a couple of points just on humanitarian conflict before I end in perhaps a more positive fashion of what we could do together. But just to remind you, if you don't already know, that there have been more deaths of healthcare workers alone in the last year than there have in humanitarian crisis in the last 4 made up altogether. And that's because of conflict and displacement. There's 123 million reported by UNHCR of displaced people in conflict. 3/4 of these displaced people live in countries affected by climate change. They flee war, then they go to another country, and then they have to flee floods, you know, catastrophic floods or droughts because of natural disasters and climate change. And Kenya, Burundi, Brazil are examples of this. In terms of other climate field health effects in humanitarian crisis, I think it goes without saying, outbreaks, new diseases, gender violence, and also lack of access to vaccines, whether from the resurgence, whether from lack of supply, like that we're immediately seeing with the US withdrawing from Gavi and other international mechanisms, or whether it's just misinformation locally. So really a lot to deal with. And while the UN, such as UNHCR, are calling now, for climate financing, like many other entities are, it's really a time of reckoning for this world of global health. We define global health as equity everywhere, also domestically. So your lessons and your methodologies that you've used in this report, I really see it as part of, the global health milieu that we can respond to elsewhere. We're fighting for the same things. We're fighting for equity and for the populations most affected. So my last message is really, let's be we really have to like work better at communicating and integrating our communities on the back of what Santa said before, with the basis really on human rights and people at the centre. Sorry I spoke too long. I'd written too many notes last night.
No apology needed, Selina, and we can sense the passion you have and the vigour that you that enables the sort of work you do, and you live and breathe it, and you just really personify the values that I think we all look to aspire to in this field of global health. So really respect your leadership and your commitment and your endurance, especially in the face of all of these challenges. And it is a time of reckoning, as you noted, and I think it's a great time to now dig a bit deeper into the litigation side of things, because the health community is looking at other ways to express the impacts of climate change and to actually make sure that we're progressing both in mitigation and adaptation activities. And so how can we look to our legal fraternity to support that articulation? So it's all in your court, Beck. How can we collaborate with our legal friends now, but it would be great to hear from you some reflections on some of the cases that you know about over the last sort of year or two that have included health. So welcome, Beck.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm not scary. Lawyers aren't scary. I think this is a really interesting area that I think lawyers don't do a very good job sometimes of demystifying what we're talking about. And litigation is a really powerful tool, I think, because at its heart, it's about stories. You can always, with your plaintiffs and your applicants in these cases, they're telling a really important story about what is happening to them. And there's really important intersection between the work of lawyers and health workers. So, for example, in court hearings, lawyers are dependent upon evidence like this as to what are the health impacts of climate change on the people who are being affected by the particular cases. So Australia is also just a really interesting hotspot for climate litigation. That's a term that's bandied around a lot, and we're the jurisdiction with the second highest number of cases worldwide, second only to the United States. So climate litigation has a really long history in Australia. I think the first case was back in 1992, and it's just been growing with time. And health has started to become a trend in more recent cases. To start my comments before talking about some of the cases from the last year or so, which are really interesting, in Jackie Peel, the director of Melbourne Climate Futures, in our work, we often distinguish between cases, first generation climate change cases and second and next generation climate change cases. So by first generation cases, we mean what provisions have historically been relied upon in our law to challenge, to raise climate change in litigation. And so historically, we've had a long body of cases that deal with climate change impacts under our environmental and planning law legislation. And so what that means is if you want to build a new coal mine in Australia, you need to get a licence and a permit for that. And there are particular you need to satisfy particular criteria under the different pieces of legislation to determine whether or not it's going ahead. So this is an area where health has started to feature in judgments in these planning and environmental law cases. And I'll just point out, this is those first generation cases, a few from last year. So 2 new cases were filed last year, both in Queensland. There's a thermal coal mine and a metallurgical coal mine going ahead. So the distinction between those is quite important. So a thermal coal mine, that's for electricity generation. We have many alternative sources for that, renewables. And there's also metallurgical coal, also called coking coal, and that's still essential for the production of steel. So one of these cases challenges an extension to an existing thermal coal mine. This is really evidence says we don't need any more thermal coal. We've got renewable sources of energy. We need to be phasing that out very, very quickly. And so in this case, we've got an environmental group suing this coal mine for basically not considering the impacts of climate change of this project overall. And so the environmental group is saying that This decision will have significant human rights impacts in Queensland and beyond. Their health is going to be increasingly impacted. So their right to life, other human rights, right to culture of First Nations people, the right for children. And so through climate change and extreme weather, there'll be increasing temperatures, heat waves, bushfires, storms, and this will affect the health of all people. So this environmental group is challenging the extension to this thermal coal mine. And so that was only filed this year. It'll be heard in the coming years. Another case in Queensland raises similar arguments, but this is about a metallurgical coal mine. So it's the same human rights implications, the same human health implications of this project, and trying to make sure that when the court, so in Queensland, they have a land court which recommends to the minister whether or not the mine should be approved. They're trying to say, well, minister, tell the court should say to the minister, you shouldn't be allowing this coal mine to go ahead because of its impacts on climate change, and that includes the impacts on human health. So those are two new cases that haven't been decided yet, but I think will be really interesting to follow those. Then 3 other cases were heard pursuant also to these planning and environment law cases. One in Queensland and 2 in New South Wales. The one in Queensland was again for a metallurgical coal mine, and it was an extension of that for the production of steel. So in this case, the court accepted all the evidence that had been approved in previous judgments that are mentioned in the report, so the youth verdict in Waratah coal case. In that case, the judge found that climate change is going to have significant impacts on the human rights of Queenslanders and beyond. So these include health impacts, particularly for children, First Nations people, and their right to life. So in this case, the judge accepted that climate change is a threat to life, children, equality before law. He accepted that the emissions are going to increase the adverse effects to the environment. So there'll be increasing deaths from bushfires, heat waves, mosquitoes, floods and cyclones. But the court concluded that there will be a demand for metallurgical coal in years to come. And so although this decision might dismay many climate advocates, the mine was recommended to be approved, the extension to this mine. So this is a really common trend in Australia law where, I mean, for many years, we just didn't even consider the impacts of climate change in our litigation. So at the federal level, our Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act doesn't actually mention climate change once in the actual piece of legislation. So there's been a really long trend of just not even thinking about climate change. And now even in these decisions where we recognise that climate change is a risk, particularly to human health amongst other impacts, there are circumstances saying, no, these mines should still go ahead. The 2 other cases in New South Wales are also fairly depressing. These are examples of, again, pursuant to those environmental and planning law provisions, one of them was, there's an important distinction in law between something called merits review and judicial review. Just briefly, merits review is about whether or not the decision is the correct decision. Those were those 2 cases that I just described. Judicial review just says it's not about whether or not the decision was right. It was just whether or not it was made according to law. So you took into account all the circumstances that you were required to by legislation. So one of the cases in New South Wales was an extension to the Mount Pleasant coal mine. This again, thermal coal. And the court said, the environmental group basically said, the decision maker hasn't adequately considered the impacts of climate change on human health in this decision, amongst other impacts, and also air pollution from the mine. And the court said, no, the minister did consider it, so their approval should be allowed to stand. The other case in New South Wales was a mine was granted a licence, an open cut coal mine was granted a licence back in 2012. Those licences are required to be reviewed every 5 years for their compliance with the licence. Community group said the coal mine has failed to comply with their requirements, including air pollution, and so therefore their licence should be revoked and included climate change. And the court said, no, again, they considered these impacts of climate change, so the licensee should still be able to continue to dig coal out of the ground. So that paints a picture that our environmental and planning laws, whilst they're starting to pick up climate change impacts, including to human health, there's still a lot of work to be done to be actually making sure that if it impacts human health, in many cases, we shouldn't be allowing thermal coal mines, and particularly, and eventually coking coal, the metallurgical coal mines from going ahead. The one final case that I will mention is an example of, and these are just cases from last year, so there's other cases that have been happening as well. But I mentioned there are these first generation cases, so the planning cases. We're now seeing next generation climate cases. So what I mean by that is these are cases brought pursuant to other pieces of law that we have. So you think of, we have corporate law, we have negligence, we have a whole range of other areas of law through which people are starting to seek redress for the impacts of climate change. So there's a case called Pabai and the Commonwealth. This is a case where Torres Strait Islanders are suing the Australian government for failing to act on climate change, and this is in negligence, saying that they owe them a duty of care. This is very much the same argument that was used in the Sharma litigation a few years ago, where Australian school children sued the Australian government for failing to act on climate change. So in Pabai, last year the court hearings were heard on country. And so the court heard evidence about the impacts of climate change on health of the Torres Strait Islander people, amongst other things. There were risks of fatigue, heat stress, the impact on water supplies, the unavailability of food, diseases, rising sea levels. And so that was part of the decision to say, part of the evidence before the court asking them to determine, does the Australian government owe Torres Strait Islanders a duty of care to act on climate change? So we expect to see a judgment from that this year. I think that will be a very interesting judgment to follow.
Whoa, amazing, Beck. Such an incredible knowledge you have of all of the cases going on. And that was just really an overview of last year. So lots of activity happening. And I think many of us are looking at that Papai one in particular this year to see what happens of that. Arthur, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was wondering if I could ask you a question, Beck. I've heard a lot about this International Court of Justice climate change opinion that's being considered. Would you be able to say a few words on that?
Yeah, good question. If only Jackie Peel was here. So I'm not an international lawyer, but I can speak briefly about this decision. So at the international level, we have the International Court of Justice, and they can be petitioned by the United Nations General Assembly to provide what they call advisory opinions. So these advisory opinions provide a statement of what are the legal obligations of states under international law. And this decision is about what are the legal obligations about states to act on climate change. And so that movement's been really led by a lot of countries, including Pacific Island countries, because climate change is an existential threat to those countries. And so that decision should come out pretty soon, actually, that advisory opinion. And it will just provide guidance to states in terms of what are their obligations under international law. So this isn't domestic law. What I talked about was domestic law. What are their obligations under international law? And I'm presuming that it will have discussion of the health impacts of climate change.
Yeah, I just particularly remember the Director General of the World Health Organization also testifying, and there's quite a lot of health evidence being put into that court. So I'm sure it will have implications for national court cases down the track as well. So it's exciting development.
Yeah. And on that, Arthur, having heard the trends we're seeing in the legal space, perhaps you could comment on what are some of the trends we're seeing globally around climate change and human health, given your global perspective and your work in this area for many years.
Yeah, thanks, Kathryn. I was just reflecting on Paul's comments as well, and just one key takeaway that I got out of the report was that there are some positive signals in terms of Australia's response to climate change now that are popping up, initial sort of positive signals in terms of renewable energies picking up, transport improving. But one of the conclusions that stood out to me in the report was that we're really still lacking a more detailed sort of comprehensive policy response from the Australian government. It's very haphazard at the moment, not very comprehensive. And I was just reflecting on one initial opportunity to have a more comprehensive approach is the demand now for the Australian government to update its nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, its NDC, which all countries are supposed to do this year. Australia was planning to do this earlier this year, but with the federal election has been pushed back. So depending on the election results, there will be probably an updated national emissions reduction target, an NDC, coming out in the next couple of months, I would assume. I think what is really exciting about this year's NDC from Australia, so it will set a 2035 emission reduction target, but underneath that target, there will actually be detailed sectoral decarbonization plans for 6 different sectors in quite a lot of detail. And so I'm hoping that that will provide a bit more meat on the bone, so to say. There will be more measures, a clear timeline, and hopefully that will create a bit more transparency and public debate really around what is needed. How do we get there by 2035? It's a 10-year timeline. So I'm hoping that that will give us a sense of direction a little bit more in Australia. Just on climate and health in Australia, I do feel like we've come quite a long way in the last 3 years, and that's something we should also celebrate. Just reflecting on 3 years ago in the lead up to the federal election, it was really the health community who managed to get climate health on the political agenda and got that commitment to have a climate health unit, as we heard from the assistant minister, have a federal strategy in place on climate and health. And on paper, at least, that federal strategy is actually one of the most comprehensive national strategies on climate health in the world, really. Australia has one of the most carbon-intensive healthcare sectors in the world, as the Countdown report already highlighted last year, I think. And that's still the case. So there's lots of different actions laid out there in terms of how the health sector can take action, but it also goes well beyond the health sector. And that's not something we see very often in other countries. So in that sense, it is on paper really great. I think the 2 main barriers that it now faces is a lack of funding. And I think people, organizations like CAHA, who are also in the room, have been, and DA as well, have been calling for dedicated funding for the strategy for years now. But then also perhaps a lack of political prioritization of this issue. And so just thinking of how successful we were 3 years ago with the federal election, we're 3 years on now, I do feel it's time for us to get creative and think about how do we get this back on the political agenda, because there's just no political leadership when it comes to climate health right now in Australia, it's in my opinion. So that's one. So I feel like there's opportunities nationally for climate health in Australia for increasing that action. On the international front, I feel like Australia also has a great opportunity to step into a stronger leadership role. It was only last year that Australia actually played quite an important role in getting a World Health Assembly resolution on climate health through, which really set a global agenda for the UN agency's health agency, UN's health agency, the World Health Organization, to take more action on climate change and health. Australia played a really important role there. I know Australian government colleagues are in Geneva right now for the final round of pandemic treaty negotiations, where they're also trying to fill a void that's been left by the US retreating. So there's plenty of opportunities for Australia to step up. They've done more also in the Pacific lately. And maybe last point is that one big opportunity just around the corner, potentially, is Australia's bid to host COP31 in a year and a half from now. I assume we'll know more about whether or not that goes ahead in a couple of months once the election is over. And there's still one other country that we're bidding with. But just yesterday, we had the president of Palau, Pacific Island state of Palau, visiting Australia, expressing the support of all Pacific Island countries for Australia to take on this bid. So I think it would come at a very interesting time for Australia to host a potential COP it would be in 2026, it would be COP31. Because COPs are changing quite a lot now. For the last 10 years, they've been very much focused on negotiating the Paris Agreement, all the rules around the Paris Agreement, negotiating rules on carbon markets and how much countries have to finance, how much they have to report. But all of that is done now. All of that has been negotiated, and there's a big shift towards implementation now. This year's COP will be very implementation focused, and from then on, I think it will be very implementation focused. So Australia has an opportunity really to step up and pick up a few key issues and really drive an implementation agenda around these issues. And I do think climate and health in particular does stand a good chance of being one of those priorities, especially thanks to the work of many people in this room to keep it high on the agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arthur. And I think reflecting on some of the comments you just made about getting creative, stepping up, implementation, I'd now pass to the panel, reflecting on my earlier comment around advocacy and bringing it back to us. Most of us are at a university setting here. What is our role as researchers to step up, to implement, to get creative? So Santa, perhaps I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. I think, I mean, as a university, I guess we have three pillars: research, teaching, and engagement with society. And I guess in this lens, engagement includes a role for advocacy. But I think that the nature of our advocacy is informed by our role around being high quality gatherers and synthesizers of knowledge, turning that knowledge into or information into knowledge, making it digestible and helping people understand how it fits into the architecture of broader knowledge, and of course teaching. And I think we have tremendous success now with teaching students. This is a very important area, and right across different portfolios across the university, there's a lot of interest among students in becoming equipped with the skills to take this issue forwards. I think that one of the challenges that we have is that how will I put it? But I guess is making sure that we're speaking to people who might disagree with us, or at least for whom change is more expensive or difficult to make. And that's in public health, of course. Well, as a clinician, your role is to look after the patient in front of you, whether or not they like you. And I guess in public health, our role is to work for the health of society, and try to ensure that we are achieving health outcomes, even for populations who may not always agree with the people who are providing that information, perhaps, especially in a polarized world. And I think here we're in an even more polarized context where, unfortunately, health has become political, especially public health, and this component of health has the risk and has a history of being highly political. Yet, ultimately, we're all united around the idea that health and especially achieving equity is as a universal goal. So I think that's a challenge that sometimes that we will need to address in our path going forwards.
Thank you, Santa. Any other reflections on advocacy from anyone on the panel?
Thanks. Thank you for all of those comments, and I would challenge Santa and say health is always political. I think you knew I was going to say that, especially public and global health. I mean, we have been very good at creating and producing biomedical solutions and modalities for certain diseases and challenges. We haven't been good at all in terms of, maybe that's too depressing an outlook, but we haven't been as good at addressing with the same systematic approach the political challenges. So in terms of advocacy platforms, the Alliance is an Australian national peak body for global health organisations, of which University of Melbourne, thank you so much for your support, has always been a founding member and is a strong part of the Alliance. We create platforms where they do not otherwise exist to strengthen the ecosystem with government, with private sector philanthropy, and also with wider society as a whole. And there is a platform in the government part, which is a bipartisan parliamentary Friends of Global Health, which was just set up 2 years ago with the new government at that time. And we've hosted a number of events there. What we haven't hosted, though, is a climate and health event, which I've been hoping for quite some time as an opportunity to bring a lot of people together, but also perhaps talk more directly about these pandemic threats, about AMR, antimicrobial resistance, all of these impacts that I started to allude to earlier. Also have interest to engage private sector and philanthropy. We've got a couple of reports coming out, and Kathryn, you've been a really strong supporter and part of the film festival, which is an arts platform, to talk about some of these hard things, whether it's the conflict in Gaza, whether it's DI, if we get cancelled on talking about that, we can still talk about it in film and those things. We also have a role in convening. I'm talking about the Alliance, but I'm just saying in general, these are like the advocacy modalities, convening, whether it's University of Melbourne, MCF convening, or whether it's some of the others or the students. We must and continue to convene beyond our own people. And then finally, just to throw in, there are regional opportunities. I know that I iterated really quite kind of negative viewpoint of the current global order, but there are so many regional opportunities. I mean, Asia and Africa nations have for a very long time, including the Middle East, have both wealth, huge research communities of which we all partner with. And as a health community, whether it's public, global, or whatever you want to call it, we have an opportunity to keep strengthening our existing science networks in the face of all political and ecological challenges. So just to put that there as their advocacy modalities we can all use. And you have done it so beautifully with this. So thank you.
I think there's such important points in terms of looking at the strengths, what lies around us beyond the dire other situation that we are also observing. And to me also, it's about those partnerships with our colleagues and, being able to work with people whose values you respect and who are on a similar path in terms of their ambition around action, particularly climate action, action around health equity, so many different areas. Any other comments on advocacy before I then open the floor to the audience for Q&A? Paul, please.
Yeah, I think advocacy is really important, and it's really important for everyone doing research. So with the Lancet Countdown, doing rigorous research is the start of the process. So we had our report published on Monday this week, but we now embark on a very rigorous campaign of engaging with the community, engaging with government and policymakers. And that's an interactive process. So I think everyone doing research needs to be doing research that is beneficial, that's relevant, and engaging with the entire community to do that. So with the Lancet Countdown here in Australia, we engage with peak health and medical bodies. So we've already mentioned the Public Health Association of Australia, the Australian Medical Association and so on. We engage with NGOs such as CAHA, the Climate and Health Alliance. And we also engage with the media, with government, and we need to engage with business as well. Everyone needs to be a part of the solution to climate change and health and climate change issues. And we can gain by talking with each other. We're not going to be able to do this from a purely research perspective. We need to be getting into people's heads, knowing what they're thinking, how they're behaving, and getting their input on what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, as we've said, the countdown is such an integral ingredient to support that advocacy and getting into people's heads. I like the way you frame that. Okay, time for questions from the audience, please. We've got about 20 minutes. So yes, down the front. Do we have any mics to share or?
No.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, where you're from and then your question.
John, I'm just a general member of the public. What do you say to politicians when they give everyone a tax cut and then turn around and say, we're cutting funding, we're cutting your funding?
Do you mean in terms of we're cutting university funding?
Yeah, like taxes is what you need to, it's the money that governments need to do the work they need to do, right? So when they give everyone a tax cut and then turn around and say, we're cutting your funding, well, what's the question you ask them?
I'm not the Vice Chancellor. I don't get to have that direct conversation, but I do, interact at the level of, well, I'm very, that is exactly what keeps me awake at night. There's a lot of advocacy. There's connection. I can see Minister Kearney was on the, is engaged with this issue, and I think the medical research community needs to communicate clearly the value of what it does, and so for those of you who, there's probably many researchers here as well as people from the public. Commonly, researchers, some of the metrics and the way that researchers evaluate themselves and the way they think of themselves are not always clearly of value to society, even though indirectly they are. So to be perfectly frank, I think you introduced me with my great publications. I'm so proud of them. However, it's not actually the publications that matter, it's the impact of the work that matters. And probably I should have changed my bio. I know, that's taught me something. So really what we do is, we create knowledge and we provide it through publications, and we communicate to each other, often using a set of outputs that don't really mean a lot to the real world. And sometimes when I look at ourselves and I imagine what we must look like from the outside, it's sort of crazy. I think we need to think about how we communicate our impact directly in terms of the actual real goal for what we're trying to achieve, which is to improve health, to combat disease, to achieve equity, and to manage that around, in this context, around climate change and health. And so that's, so as much as I think we also need to keep our house in order as and improve our communications. In terms of the decisions that politicians make, I think it's really about making it more difficult for them to make that decision when the public understands the true value of what we do. I'm glad that you're here today.
Well, yes, just like things like tax reform is, like if you have a look at the best countries to live are high taxing countries, because their governments can do, what they need to do.
Arthur? Yeah.
Just quickly to add to that as well, in the context of climate change and health, thinking about some of the investments we have to make, in many cases, there is a cost saving by implementing some of these things. Reducing, switching to renewable, reduce air pollution, will reduce healthcare costs, will keep people healthier, etc. The problem often is that we're not always that good at estimating what those cost savings will be, and they don't show up in the books. They'll benefit people throughout society, but they don't show up in the budget. So actually being able to estimate those cost savings and those benefits we're all gaining, but then how do you account for them? Where do they show up? That there's just spread across, and so one sector might have to invest while everybody else benefits. So that sort of accounting is something quite tricky when we're looking at climate change action.
It's like a blue chip investment. So the money you spend now, you get back in the future.
Exactly. And then the last thing to say maybe is also that more and more we need to start looking at what happens if we don't act. What is the cost of inaction? If we don't invest in these things, what will be
cost a lot more if you don't spend the money now.
Exactly.
There's a really good number that the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria use. This was a fund set up over 20 years ago to combat AIDS, TB and malaria in the world. And they say that at least, globally, $1 invested is $15 return. They've done multiple, economic analysis around that. And the Global Fund itself now has a climate policy. It is really intent on delivering its programs also equitably with hand in hand with climate partners, climate action partners on the ground as well. But you're right, we're not always good at getting to that number because it's complex. Complex things are never that simple. But secondly, even when we have it, I mean, how many people actually know that figure? What we need is propaganda machine. We need our own, health needs almost a media that is very aligned and very educated about and able to churn it out quite quickly with whatever modalities. And I call it propaganda because the counterpoint is also propaganda. I mean, the misinformation and disinformation that we face. Yeah.
One complication to that, I think the Global Fund is a good example where they've tried often, what is the return on investment? If you invest in Mozambique's climate health work, for every $1 you get $4 back or whatever. The problem, the danger with those sort of measures is that we'll only be investing in the things that are easily measurable.
Thanks for saying that.
And often that leads to very technocratic solutions, all they need is mosquito nets and vaccinations and everything's solved. You can't measure everything is also a problem. And that's also true for academia. There's lots of valuable academic work that might not necessarily have very concrete output straight away as well. And so there is value in maintaining that as well, not putting a dollar figure on everything, because that's just feels like late stage capitalism to me. We don't have to put a dollar figure on everything, but to try and assess the value of something can also happen beyond just a dollar figure.
And maybe the, the caveat to everything is back to what you said earlier, which is really having, faces and people at the centre of a lot of stories. I mean, just continue doing what we're doing now, but better, and communicate, because the methodologies are inexact. As advocates, we're often asked, can you put a dollar on it? I mean, I know this, I've been in meetings where it's constantly there, and I'm really relieved when groups like MSF come out. I don't know if you've seen their article recently. They come out with an article around the pre-election saying, vote for humanity. I feel really relieved, because then we don't have to make that, analysis in our heads for why we're choosing to vote, this way or another. Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, there's that tendency that you have to put a dollar figure on everything.
And just one more comment. I think the law is really important in all of this as well. And having legislation in place that mainstreams climate change across all government decision making. So the gold standard in this is really the United Kingdom. They've got a piece of legislation called the Climate Change Act, and it's been in place since 2007. And it's just path-breaking, because they have a requirement to develop plans both on mitigation and adaptation across all sectors of the economy. So it covers health, and it covers the financial sector, and the corporate sector and the business sector, and buildings and transport. And I think that's sort of entrenching climate change and mainstreaming it in legislation is really, really powerful. That's the role of law, I think, in all of this.
Yeah, that's really important, Beck. And I think that there's some work perhaps to be done to understand what was the catalyst to set up that Climate Change Act in the UK. And was it a particular politician? Was it their advisor? Was it their neighbour? We need to really understand what those tipping points are for those types of really, really incredibly valuable policy changes. I'm going to go in the room, then online for questions. So the next one's online. It's from Flo Loader, who's here at the University of Melbourne. Hi, Flo. Her question is, if planning approvals are going ahead, but there are effects on human health, should the Health Minister also have a say in whether or not to approve these licences?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think that like everything we do, our work is often very siloed. So you have the Health Minister making health decisions. You've got the Environmental Minister making environmental decisions. I think what's been quite encouraging about this government in particular is that they've tried to be it's not just Anthony Albanese who's the face of the Labor Party, it's actually all of the ministers. So you often see them working together, policy announcements will be from multiple policy ministers. Should the Health Minister have a say in these environmental and planning decisions? I think there could be evidence admitted usually it's from experts, and so they'll submit a report that the court will take into account in making the decision. But I think it's really important that health does feature in these decisions. I don't think it's necessarily mainstreamed at the moment. I don't think the Environment Minister, when they make planning environmental and permitting decisions, goes down the corridor to the Health Minister. But I think we would all benefit from having more collaboration across sectors. And I think that's true of universities as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Beck. Question there, please.
Actually, another question for Beck around the litigation database. I'm curious, do you, the cases you talked about were mostly around sort of coal mine expansion, that sort of stuff. I'm wondering also, there's obviously a lot of litigation which is effectively climate change litigation because it's around, for example, building transmission lines or wind farms. And, there are real issues there around environmental interests and so forth. So I'm just wondering, does your database track that, and how does it, obviously there's always trade-offs and so forth, but, we want a wind farm so that we can shut down the coal-fired power stations, but we don't want a wind farm because it's going to destroy my amenity and so forth. So how do you are you tracking those, and how does that sort of factor into your database?
That's a really good question. And the answer is yes, we do. So we take a really broad approach to defining cases that are in our database that include climate change. So we include cases where climate change is like a central issue in the dispute. So there's like the coal mine cases. And that's clearly centrally about climate change because it's about approval for a coal mine. But we also include decisions like other planning decisions. Like if you're building a house next to the sea, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to build your property in that particular place. We also sort of include cases really at the peripheral of climate change issues. So an example of that might be if you've got what I think might happen in the future. If you've got a big company that collapsed because they've failed to act on climate change, there'll be issues about the liquidation of that company. There'll be issues about corporate contracts in the future and how they're frustrated by climate change. So we also include those kind of cases in the database as well. Your point about the approvals for renewables, that is a really topical question because in the paper, probably about 2 weeks ago, I saw that the Victorian minister had said they've introduced into Victorian legislation a fast-track approvals process for, I think it was solar panels. There's somewhere out near the Grampians where they're just going to put a whole bunch of solar panels in there. And they market it as being like, we need to fast-track these approvals. They need to go through, so trying not to have it slowed down by litigation and bogged down in the weeds. And I think that there's a really difficult question because you say, if you were doing this in the coal mining context, you'd be outraged. You'd be so angry. But in the renewables context, is it also okay to remove the safeguards, the procedural fairness? We've had litigation in Australia, about wind farms and the amenity impacts of that. So does the climate crisis justify restricting the appropriate oversight of the process? I don't know the answer to that. That's really hard. So yes, we do include those cases, and I think they raise really interesting issues for us.
Thank you.
Such great questions and terrific answers, Beck. Any other questions? Yes, please, Urvi.
I have a question that the report this year talks about developing and focusing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands as well as mental health impacts and climate change. What do you think could be some of the challenges or opportunities in developing these critical indicators?
That's a great question as well. Thank you very much. We had a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander indicator a few years ago, using essentially Australian government data, looking at housing, access to health and so on. And we stopped that indicator for a couple of reasons. One is the government stopped collecting that data. It was survey-based data. But more importantly than that, the indicator was not developed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we're now working with a team of 3 Indigenous Australians to develop a brand new indicator. Again, will be survey-based, but it will be Indigenous-based surveys, looking at things like connection to country and so on. It's a very hard indicator to develop, even for just the one country. So we're hoping to bring it in this year, but we didn't have time to do that. But yeah, definitely for next year's report, we hope that Indigenous indicator will be there. But it's vital, again, that we work with the community that we're designing these indicators for. In terms of mental health, again, we did have a mental health indicator several years ago, looking at one end of the spectrum, I suppose you could call it, in terms of mental health. And that was the connection between extreme temperatures and suicide in Australia. And that's a valid indicator. The reason we stopped that indicator was the member of the team who was doing that basically retired. So there is some scope to bring that one back in again. But again, we're working with a team of mental health experts in the climate change area, and probably bringing in an indicator that's more towards the sort of lower end of the mental health spectrum. Suicide is important, but there's a lot of people in Australia with climate anxiety, mental health issues from extreme events, flooding, fires and so on. So again, we're in the process of developing that indicator. We want to make sure it's as good as possible, so we're not going to rush it. It's been on the go for a couple of years now, but yeah, hopefully for next year's report that will be there. So thank you very much for the question.
Thanks, Paul. On that question, was there another? Oh, yes, Mark.
Sorry.
Welcome.
Okay.
Welcome. Here's one of the esteemed authors of the.
And thank all of you for the terrific work and Paul leading it. It's great. Look, I just wanted to pick up on that point, just to also highlight, I mean, these indicators are very dynamic. And just to pick up on your point, Paul, around the electric vehicles, I guess just to highlight that some of the work we're starting to do could even flip the positivity around electric vehicles to highlight, in fact, they're actually detrimental to climate change. And it could be in the next 1 or 2 years in our indicators, we're getting a handle on the life cycle assessment of these vehicles. And we're also getting a real handle around what comes from the tyres. And we know, for example, the carbon linked to that, but particularly PM2.5 and what's coming from that and the effect it has on respiratory disease. So look, I'm not saying it here and now, but what I'm wanting to highlight is that they are very dynamic, some of these indicators, and they could flip to being something that appeared to be quite a valuable component, may not be in the end. And particularly if we look much broader in terms of the system that we're operating in and the effects it has on comorbidities around chronic disease and inactivity and everything else, that we know the transport system we currently have is one that's been totally delivered around motorised society. And we know what the effects of that is on our health, and it's increasingly adverse. So I guess what we wanted to highlight is advocating EVs is just advocating a system we've had now for 100 years. It's not of value to our health to the extent we think it is. So I think having these indicators at the forefront of everything is just horrific. And our role in the advocacy piece is just even more important as well. And being able to lead it and actually highlight changes is really what we're going to have to focus on as well.
Great points, Mark. How do we disrupt the system as a whole? I think might be what you're saying, and start by riding your bike more. So yeah, wonderful. I think, but that point is really important because also in the attribution science literature, where we're starting to look at more health impacts and quantifying those, that might also not always work in our favour. So yeah, really, really important to better understand the nuances of these types of work. We have come to the end, but before we finish from the panel, I'd love to hear a very 10-second thought bubble from you all, and this is what we asked our panel to do in our subject, climate change and human health this week, was to leave us with what gives you hope working in your field. So we might, I know Arthur, you look like you're thinking, but I think we might start from you at that end.
Be done with it. Something I actually really love is just looking around the room, and like we have people from the general public here. We have people like Kaha here who've been advocating for more than 10 years for this area. We have people from the Department of Health here, academics. It's actually quite impressive to just see who's in the room and online and who's interested and is with us on this journey. So yeah, I feel lucky to be part of this community, really.
Thanks, Arthur. Beck?
I think that what gives me hope is that this is just such a really interesting field, and it's really important, and there are lots of really wonderful people working in the space. So there's lots of opportunities. That's what gives me hope.
Young people and diversity. Young people because all of the demographic shifts are already happening globally, and diversity, by that I mean both planetary and human diversity. I think if we were to bring the global health mainstream and the planetary health mainstream together, where we're reaching our nexus is in biodiversity and human diversity, and that always keeps me fascinated, interested. I learn more, and gives me hope.
Thank you.
I think we always have to be positive and be looking at the opportunities. And the Lancet Countdown is all about looking at the opportunities that we have before us in dealing with climate change. So I think in Australia, things are now looking positive in many respects. We can certainly improve, but I think we've turned the corner to some extent and we need to keep that going. Obviously, there's been some turmoil internationally, but again, I think we can use that turmoil to actually unify the rest of the world to act on a whole range of issues, one of those being climate change, one of those being human health. So I think rather than letting what's happening in the US fracture things, we actually need to have that unifying us. So we need to use that energy in a positive way. I also wanted to reflect on the support for health and climate change academically in Australia and the region through the Medical Journal of Australia, which we've been partnering with from the very beginning. So I think that's a very positive sign, and the latest issue of the journal has more than our paper looking at the health and climate change issue. So I think there's a great depth of expertise and knowledge in Australia in health and climate change, and we can use that not only to benefit Australia, but also the region and the world.
Thanks, Paul. And Santa.
Thanks. I think across the healthcare sector and in health research and public health research, we have tremendous unmet need, but we also have tremendously passionate and creative people. And I'm seeing across the faculty and outside the faculty, across the country, around the world, really interesting research activities that are occurring, looking at new solutions and looking at uncovering problems and driving solutions through those. That is really mind-blowing. And I think that being able to support that creativity is what will take us to the next step.
Thank you, Santa. And on those points, actually, we've just got a couple of slides to show you as we finish up. The first one is going to show you the link to the climate policy tracker we've currently got live at the moment. So what this policy tracker will do is looking through all of the different parties' commitments to climate change, not just health, but all, many climate change issues. Does that come up? Yep, that's fantastic. So please take a photo of that. That's dynamic. That'll be updated every few days. We've got the master document behind that where the researchers who are part of the University of Melbourne, but beyond us, are contributing to this to really articulate what are the commitments that are taking place on all elements of climate change, not just climate and health. So that's the first part. I think you've all got a photo. And then the next slide, building on your point around creativity, Santa, one of our favourite projects at Melbourne Climate Futures is called Sonic Youth, and it's all about hearing the sounds from people in rural Victoria that resonate with them and give them hope for the future. So that is a project that's also led by a composer, the head of composition at Fine Arts and Music, Miriam Young, and it'll be performed at the Melbourne Recital Centre in May by the Omega Ensemble, who is they're a great ensemble from Sydney. So please also take note of that performance, and that's how we're using creativity to really connect and communicate around issues of climate change and environmental change, also with an intergenerational justice perspective. So with those two plugs, which you should expect when you come to a seminar that's run at the university, we'd love to, please join me in thanking the panel, Santa, Paul, Selina, Beck and Arthur, all of you online and in the room for such great questions that really sparked a fantastic discussion. So many thanks and see you at the next event.